Today, on a very special and format-breaking episode of the show, we're going to be talking about The X-Files, the long-running Fox TV series. How has the show held up over the years? We'll take a closer look.
Welcome to Film Club.
So, Katie, by total coincidence, the two of us have recently started rewatching The X-Files.
Yes, and by total coincidence, you mean that we both like the X-Files. I feel like we both are X-Files people, and we've had a lot of time at home lately, so...
I think that's probably what it is. I mean, it's sort of comfort food, you know, you reach for a favorite show during this time. We did not coordinate this, but I believe we both sort of started rewatching the show around the same time. Yeah, I've, we're going to get more into this throughout the episode. I've been a fan of The X-Files since almost the start. I was a child when the show first aired, and I've rewatched it. This will probably be my third go-through. I'm kind of doing an abbreviated rewatch of the show, where I sort of do not force myself to watch episodes that I'm not a big fan of, but I've been sort of doing a targeted run through of the series again. I'm
watching every single episode, so I don't know if I'm as far along as you are in the rewatch, because I am watching every single episode. Some of them are, I've seen them before, and I know they're not that great, and so they're just sort of background noise, company in my apartment. I was joking with a friend the other day that on the episodes, because there is a certain... I guess compulsion is the word, to be thorough with something like this. Where you're like, well, I can't skip any of the episodes. And so I was telling a friend that the episodes that I don't really like, I just look up whenever somebody says Mulder or Scully.
To be clear, I love this show. I think you can skip some episodes.
You can skip some episodes, yeah. But it's interesting to watch every single episode, over an extended period of time. It's not the only thing I'm watching. You watch a lot of movies too, but it is interesting to see, like, when you are thorough in that way, you start to see like the certain themes come up again and again, and then you can watch the development of certain characteristics of the show in real time, so to speak, which is interesting.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. So we don't normally talk about television on this show. It's called Film Club, not TV Club.
TV Club is a whole other thing at AV Club.
That's very true. I'm sort of fond, as you know, around the office, although obviously we're not around the office right now, but generally around the office, I like to kind of rib our TV people, Danette and Eric. I'll sometimes rib them about film being the superior medium, which I do believe. Bit, yeah. Let's be clear about this. I do think that's true, but
I could sit and laugh. I'm gonna be. I worked very closely with Danette when we were both on news desk, and now she's TV editor. So I'm Switzerland in this argument. I just sit there and chuckle at it. I stay out of it.
I mean, the truth is that they, in a lot of respects, they are both very different mediums in how they operate and how we engage with them, and also obviously built on a shared foundation, a shared audio-visual foundation. I mean, the basic building blocks of these two mediums are the same in terms of both technology and how they work in a sonic and visual way. Well,
except for the deer in the headlights thing we talked about on our movie theater episode, where the brain does process signals from TVs and in a movie theater differently.
That's very true. Yeah. But, the sort of boundary separating film and television has become shakier over the years. The X-Files is... Yeah. Now we have discussions, not to get too much into how the sausage gets made, but we also have discussions on the show sometimes about what qualifies as TV's jurisdiction and what qualifies as film's jurisdiction.
Exactly.
A lot of it these streaming platforms are really blurring those lines where, something like a documentary that might premiere on HBO, does that fall under film's jurisdiction or does that fall under TV's?
Yeah, specifically the example I'm thinking of that was discussed quite a bit at AV Club was the O.J. Simpson Made in America docuseries. What section it would be covered under was when we had to discuss it because it was a very blurry case.
And quite notably, that won both an Oscar and an Emmy.
Yep.
So, that was one that the two, I guess, decided they got to share.
Like Twin Peaks. Everybody wants to claim Twin Peaks The Return also.
That's right. Now, The X-Files very clearly belongs to television. It's a TV show.
It's a TV show, yeah. It's a procedural in... What's interesting about The X-Files is, and we'll talk later about some of the notable creatives who worked on this show, who went on to create, very well-regarded TV series in the peak TV era in the 2000s, 2010s. What's interesting about The X-Files to me is that it is a blend of a procedural, which you refer to as Monster of the Week episodes, and this one in particular, which is, a more old-fashioned or standard or specific to TV format. But it blends that with what we are going to call mythology episodes, which are serialized in the manner of more, I'd say, contemporary prestige TV series.
Yeah, you're right that it sort of sits on that boundary, and I think that a lot of that has to do with when it premiered, which was in the fall of 1993, when the show first came on the air, and it does sort of bridge the gap between something like Kolchak from the 70s, which was almost purely Monster of the Week. Character sort of going every week. There's a new case and a new situation, and that serialized storytelling you're talking about, because a big part of the X-Files is unfurling this larger conspiracy that the agents are dealing with. I should say that if you've never seen the X-Files, I guess it's a little strange that you're listening to a podcast about it, but welcome.
Welcome.
I mean, maybe you're a film person who listens to us because we talk about movies generally, and today we're talking about a TV show. But for those who are unaware of this very popular television show, it follows two FBI agents, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, played by David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson, respectively. And they basically their beat is the unexplained. They're sort of what does Mulder say in the pilot? He says nobody down here but the FBI's least wanted.
Unwanted, yeah.
Yeah. So they're
FBI's most unwanted, he says, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, so the background of the story is that Mulder was once a hotshot criminal profiler, behaviorist who worked in the same sort of milieu as the characters on Mindhunter, where he was that sort of character who used criminal profiling to catch serial killers. But he has a lifelong interest in the paranormal because he believes that his younger sister was abducted by aliens when they were kids. And so, he basically gains enough clout at the FBI that he goes his own way and decides to create his own department to investigate the paranormal full time, and it's not especially popular amongst the higher ups, but they put up with him because he's just too damn good. But to sort of mitigate this, at the very beginning of the series, they assign him a younger agent, which is Dana Scully, and she is a medical doctor and a skeptic of the paranormal, so they pair them with the idea that Scully will keep Mulder in check. But of course that develops over the course of the series.
Yep. Yeah, that's sort of the dynamic they establish in that first season, that he's willing to believe in anything, basically, and she is the voice of reason, the skeptic, who is, I would say, rather constantly confronted with the reality. I will say one thing about the show's formula that I find kind of funny is that it's not like Scully is ever right to be skeptical. You know what I mean?
That's true. Well, occasionally, I will say that dynamic, though, gives them a lot of fun stuff to play with. They play with it sometimes. They'll occasionally reverse it, where Scully believes that something supernatural is going on and Mulder doesn't. And
often with a spiritual...
yes, exactly.
They establish early on that she's from a Catholic family, I believe, and
she does believe in God, yeah.
Right, and that ends up... Those do actually tend to be some really strong episodes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fun dynamic for them to play with, specifically with her being religious and how that kind of butts up against belief in the supernatural.
Yeah. So, as we said, the show premiered in the fall of 1993. It was from creator Chris Carter, who had worked, I think, a lot in comedies before that, sort of sitcoms on TV. And I sort of felt like at that time it was kind of reflecting some things that were going on culturally and subculturally, you could say, a sort of booming interest in conspiracy theories. Oliver Stone's JFK came out 2 years earlier. I think there's definitely a little bit of Stone in the DNA of the X-Files, and a growing interest in things like the paranormal and alien abduction culture. The show sort of threw that into a blender, and sort of any area of the unexplained was fair game for the series. It started on Friday nights, and it was a cult show for a while. I remember it being one of the first shows that was really kind of an internet sensation. There were tons of... It's
made for the early internet, and there are peripheral characters, these three guys, they call themselves the Lone Gunmen, and they are conspiracy theorists and buddies of Mulder's, and in some ways they're sort of stand-ins for the really devoted audience members who would
very much so,
make websites about the show and things like that.
I think there's a real overlap between people who got into this show in the early 90s and people who might genuinely fall down rabbit holes of conspiracy theory.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, they put in like some real life details and things like that. Like they talk about MUFON a lot on the show, which is the Mutual UFO Network, and that's a real thing. They didn't make it up for the show, so I imagine if you were a member of MUFON, to see it mentioned on Fox on Friday night was probably pretty thrilling in the 90s.
For sure. So the show eventually switched to Sunday nights, and it sort of, over its first few years, sort of grew its ratings every year. I remember it was very much like a very highly buzzed about show in its early years. It sort of was seen as this. It was not like a huge ratings hit immediately, but it was building a fan base slowly. I remember it started showing up on magazine covers. Things like Entertainment Weekly were promoting it really heavily in its early years, and then in the fourth season it switched to Sundays, where it kind of, I think that was one of its strongest seasons ratings wise. I think the highest rated episode of the series is still the Super Bowl episode. They aired an episode after the Super Bowl, which that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that was around I don't know for sure, but at least in my anecdotal memory, the 90s was a time when the Super Bowl really congealed as a cultural event.
Still kind of is, I would say.
I don't know what the ratings for sure. Are, but yeah. It's just like it was definitely an event in the 90s, the Super Bowl. For sure. Yeah, it had become a holiday by that point.
I was just saying that post Super Bowl slot became like whoever has the Super Bowl that year will often stick the one of their more popular shows. They'll sort of stick an episode after that, because there's that retention of audience that you get with the Super Bowl, where people are just like, what's on next, and they watch it. And I think that really benefited the X-Files. The show would go on for 9 years, for 9 seasons, and it was also recently revived a few years ago. They brought it back for a 10th season and then an 11th one. When did you get into the show?
Okay, so we've discussed this on the show a little bit before about how I was not allowed to really engage with more R-rated adult sort of scary horror content when I was a kid, but my parents didn't mind me watching the X-Files because it was a network show, and so in some ways it was a gateway drug for me. I don't think I watched it when it was on Fridays. I didn't start watching it until it was on Sundays. But for me, I watched it not faithfully every week, but I watched it probably from like the 4th through I think I lost interest around the 8th season, but I would watch it sometimes on Sundays as a kid, and I found it very... another thing we'll talk about later is a lot of episodes are tributes to famous horror films, and I found that very interesting when I was a kid.
That was a big hook for me too, honestly. I mean, I was a horror movie kid in a lot of ways. I actually jumped into the show in its first season. I think the first episode I caught, I actually remember this somehow, was Darkness Falls. Mm-hmm. It's an episode from the first season. Mulder and Scully are called out to investigate the disappearance of some loggers in, I believe, the Pacific Northwest, and discover that the loggers have been eaten by tiny carnivorous insects. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, I was immediately hooked. I was very much a horror movie kid, and what the X-Files seemed to present was a new horror movie every week. Basically, especially in that first season, they're like running through a lot of archetypes. So you get like a werewolf episode, you get a Bigfoot episode, and alien And of course there was the backdrop of alien abduction culture and all that, which fascinated me as well.
And as they go on, they start doing more with vampires will come up sometimes, but in the third and fourth seasons they started doing more with witchcraft and black magic.
Totally. So the show is generally, fans of the show tend to divide it into, there are sort of two modes that the X-Files takes, which is the mythology episodes, and those are the episodes that continue this ongoing story of Mulder and Scully investigating this grand government conspiracy, basically, and figuring out, sort of piecing together those parts. And then there are the Monster of the Week episodes, and these are the ones where they just are dispatched to some town, often a kind of foggy forest town, because the show was shot in Vancouver for several years. And,
yeah. There's a lot of Canadian accents in the extras. You can...
yeah, totally.
One-line characters will have a thick Canadian accent more often than not.
Totally. The Monster of the Week episodes tend to be self-contained. They tend to be standalones. We're just seeing them investigate a case, and the thing wraps up in 48 minutes or whatever. Whereas the mythology ones are sort of always to be continued in their own way. You're incrementally getting more of this. Which do you prefer?
Okay, so I always I liked the Monster of the Week. I think originally because I was an intermittent viewer, I didn't watch it faithful. I wasn't appointment television for me. It was just if I was home, I would watch it, or if I was free, I would watch the show. So I always preferred the Monster of the Week episodes. Partially because they would be more centered around creatures, and I love monsters. I always have. It's my favorite thing in movies. And so, the idea of an episode based around, like there's a lake monster episode in season 3 that I like. So I always prefer the Monsters of the Week. But it's interesting, now that I'm doing a more modern style binge watch, I'm really getting into the mythology episodes, which I wasn't before, probably because I couldn't follow it as well, because it wasn't as fresh in my mind.
Yeah, I do think the show is a little ahead of its time in that respect. You could, if you wanted to, I don't know who would do this, because I agree with you that the Monster of the Week episodes are more fun.
Yeah, they are.
I think, though, that you could string together all of the mythology episodes into a single coherent whole and just watch that if you wanted, and it would play not so radically different than modern serialized television.
Yeah, no, I definitely, because they do return to the same themes, and it is an overarching plot that develops over time. So yeah, you could definitely do a series rewatch with just the mythology episodes.
But who would want to do that, though? Seriously. Because the Monster of the Week ones are a lot more fun, I think. I
They're
always
more humorous.
Those.
One of the things that the X-Files does that's fun is it blends more straight-faced, action and sci-fi thriller with sometimes winking self-referential humor, and those tend to be the Monster of the Week episodes, the funny ones.
Totally. Yep. Yeah, there's not a lot of that in the mythology episodes.
No, not at all. It's all about their poor families. Man, they just pick them off one by one, huh?
They really do. They just kill off members of the extended Mulder and Scully families.
They don't have any siblings left.
Yeah. I will say this. Yeah, I always found the mythology episodes to be kind of... growing up, I was kind of bored by them sometimes. But I will say that as I've gotten older and I've revisited the show a couple times, there is a certain very cinematic sweep to those episodes. And they're so steeped, I think, in the kind of style and the paranoia of sort of 1970s government conspiracy movies, things like All the President's Men. There's like a lot of even in the first season, he has a regular contact named Deep Throat, and I think that very much those mythology episodes to me feel like carrying the torch of the sort of paranoid 70s thrillers.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And there is a certain scope to the mythology episodes too that I really appreciate. Just in terms of they tend to have almost a. It's funny when the movie came out in 1998. I remember thinking, watching the movie even then, that like it clicked for me watching it that like the TV show is often plays like they're trying to do cinema on TV every like week to week almost.
Sure, yeah. Particularly something that they do in a lot of the seasons is the season 2 finale is a 2-parter, and then the season 3 premiere is the second part. And if you put those 2 episodes together, it would be a 90-minute film.
Yeah. Well, they'll have these action movie. Occasionally, the scenario that they actually put the characters into is kind of a stock action movie scenario. There's an episode in the 3rd season where Mulder ends up on a train, basically on basically like a runaway train. There is one of my favorite of the Mythology episodes, Dwayne Barry from the 2nd season, is basically like a hostage thriller, but with Fox Mulder and the element of alien abduction added. So I appreciated the Mythology episodes in that respect, that they sometimes really did play like little miniature movies that you got to see on television.
And, you talk about how the Mythology series are cinematic, and we mentioned this up top, too, that the X-Files would pay tribute to different genre milestones. In the 1st season, there's an episode that plays tribute to The Thing, and there's one episode later on in the 6th season that plays a tribute to Speed, and their most infamous episode, which is the season 4 episode Home, which aired once on Fox, and they never re-aired it as a rerun because it is very disturbing. That one is sort of a tribute to The Hills Have Eyes and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I've always loved about the show, and that I've always thought is a lot of fun, is that it is almost like you take these 2 characters and you kind of insert them into horror movies or science fiction films that you've seen before, and I think the show is pretty explicit about what it's borrowing from a lot of the time. But it was always, you just have these 2 characters that the audience has grown fond of, and they're just suddenly in the middle of The Thing,
Yeah, and if you like The Thing, it's fun. There's always a fun aspect of being able to point and go, I know what they're talking about. It's always fun to feel on the inside, which may have influenced, how the show really took off on the internet, like a big obsessive horror movie fans, in general, I imagine, would appreciate that aspect of the show. And, even the characters, in a way, are tributes to other films. Like, for example, because of Mulder's background, sometimes he'll investigate serial killer cases. And in those episodes, Scully ends up being a Clarice Starling, Silence of the Lambs style character. And so you do end up with some Thomas Harris in there, too, even in the drawing of the characters, having the whole behavioral science aspect.
There's a major Silence of the Lambs influence on the X-Files. Yeah. That, of course, was released 2 years earlier. Carter has admitted as much. I mean, I think even the fact that the show is set within the FBI was directly inspired by Silence of the Lambs. I'm going to get to this later, but one of my favorite episodes of the series is a very clear Silence of the Lambs tribute. But I think for a lot of people, what kept people coming back to this show was the relationship between its main characters, between Mulder and Scully, which obviously evolved over the years. I think in the early years, it was the 1st season. There was this kind of uneasiness between them because of their roles, them not trusting each other, and that kind of grew into into a friendship, and into eventually they became kind of platonic life partners in a way. And then later on in the show's run, people were sort of shipping Mulder and Scully long before shipping was a term people were using. In some ways, they're the original ship. I don't know a lot about the history of fan fiction, but I would not be surprised if fan fiction about Mulder and Scully played a big role in the development of that online, in particular. I would imagine, yeah. I mean, I think there were a lot of people who were really invested in them getting together. The show did eventually get them together, and then broke them up.
Gotta keep the drama coming. They can only get cancer so many times.
That's true. I think that Carter always wanted them to not be an item, but then again, sometimes you got to give the audience what they want. How invested were you watching this show growing up in the Mulder and Scully relationship?
Growing up, not all that invested, but now going back as an adult, I do find myself rooting for them to get together, and it's fun watching it develop over time, because like you said, they do become closer over time, and a lot of big life changes happen, like we alluded to. Family members die and things like that, and they're both such workaholics that they don't really have anyone else in their lives. So they become very close and dependent on each other, and I don't know, it sort of seemed natural for them to get together in the end to me. So I would, it's hard for me to say because I know they get together in the end, you know what I mean? And so, like, the tension isn't really there like it would have been watching it the first time. But I do like it, and I do like when they get together. I watched an episode recently where Mulder tells Scully that he loves her, and it was nice. What about you?
Well, growing up, I didn't really care about that aspect of it, to be honest. I didn't, especially as a romance, which was just not, adolescent me was not interested in that aspect of the show.
Right.
I will say that as I've rewatched the show and as I've grown older, I have become invested in what these actors have done with these characters and the chemistry between them. Not necessarily even romantic, but how the show sort of took what could have been a stock dynamic between them and really gave it a spark of life. A lot of the funnier episodes of the show are really about the relationship between these two and how it can kind of be testy and how they kind of push each other's boundaries a little bit. I do think some of the stronger, more dramatic episodes are about sometimes about Scully's inability to meet Mulder in the middle, but also about looking at Mulder's. I mentioned Dwayne Barry earlier, which is, again, it's an episode in the second season where Mulder is brought in to help mediate a hostage situation where the person who has taken people hostage in an office building believes that he was abducted by aliens over the years. Yeah. And the whole tension of the episode isn't necessarily will Mulder survive this encounter? Will this guy kill the hostages? That's part of it, but a big part of it is Mulder's willingness to believe. Does that actually make him a dangerous element to introduce into this situation? And I really feel like the show in its best moments was really interested in the degree to which Mulder's mania and his willingness to believe, was that a good thing or not?
It's interesting you bring up Mulder's willingness to believe as sort of a dynamic element, because that's something that they play with a lot with the character of Scully. Something earlier on in the show that sort of manifests in Scully sort of being a damsel in distress more than I would like, her getting kidnapped and things like that. But over time, I think you're seeing two parallel but divergent character arcs happening, which is a really cool dynamic where Scully, it's like Mulder wants to believe too much, but Scully refuses to see what's in front of her eyes. And that push-pull is very interesting.
It is, for sure. I do think you touch on something that I would consider maybe something of a flaw in the show, which is that I feel like they always make Mulder this extremely proactive character, somebody who's always searching, and he's always trying to uncover things. He's always taking that leap. He's always doing the dangerous thing. He'll jump onto the moving train. He'll go where he's told not to go. Whereas they'll often make Scully a reactive character, not just in the sense that she's reactive to Mulder and his crazy theories, but also in the sense that the major events that happen to her are, again, all things that kind of happen to her, I mean, she gets abducted, she gets cancer at one point, she has an unexplained pregnancy. These are all things where the character has had some sort of outside force imposed upon her.
Yeah, and that's one aspect of the show, this was almost 30 years ago, and the show does kind of, there are a few episodes that I like where they do sort of get into how tough it must be for Scully. There's an episode called Irresistible that I think is in the second season that I actually like quite a bit, where it's Scully's having a hard time with the serial killer case they're working on because the killer is just obviously violently misogynistic, and she has kind of a hard time dealing with it. And there are a few episodes where she'll be disrespected, someone won't think that she's a doctor because she's a woman, things like that, different local law enforcement will give her a hard time. And I appreciate that they were kind of, gesturing towards that sort of feminist look at it. But I feel that the fact that yes, most of her conflicts are things that happen to her rather than things that she gets involved in, balances that out and may actually end up outweighing it a bit.
Yeah. I do think that Anderson is great in the role. I think that she is almost indisputably a stronger actor than Duchovny. I mean, Duchovny's perfect for that role, but Anderson does so much emotional heavy lifting, particularly in mythology episodes, and anytime that she has to cope with her character is coping with a loss, which, as we joked earlier, is more often than not. You know, I was watching an episode recently from the third season called Piper Maru, and it's a third season mythology episode, and the opening few minutes of it belong to Anderson in the sense that she has two scenes back to back, and her acting is so good that it almost breaks the show a little bit sometimes. You know,
it's too good.
She's too good, and that's a mythology episode too. And the show ends up like after these opening two scenes, the show is just barreling headfirst into the conspiracy stuff again. And I kept being like, I just want to know what's going on with Scully. I just want to know what's going on dramatically with the character, and I think that was a strength of the show, even when it was kind of getting lost in the increasingly convoluted mythology arc.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because there is a very similar thing going on in another episode. You mentioned her getting cancer. It's Memento Mori is the season 4 episode where she gets the diagnosis, and she does some really great acting in that episode. There's a scene towards the end where Mulder comes to the hospital to see her, and they have this sort of touching moment, and she's just, I mean, she really kills it in that scene. But then right after that, there's a scene where she goes, but I want to go back to work. And then the next one's a Monster of the Week episode. And it's a bit, you wish that they had let Gillian Anderson do a little more there.
I think that's the TV format kind of bumping up against it. I had a similar thought watching the second season where she's abducted and comes back. And there's a very similar conversation she has with Mulder where she's just like, gotta get back to work. And that feels more like the show reasserting its formula than a choice that makes a ton of sense for this character.
Sure, yeah. Although the character, I mean, they kind of work it into the character in the sense that she's a bit closed off, and it ties into her not wanting to acknowledge what's right in front of her face a little bit. But overall, I do think you're right that it is just the demands of television formula more than it is a deliberate character choice.
Yeah. When do you think the show jumped the shark, if ever?
The later, like, I remember season 8 having some good episodes, but kind of losing interest, and then season 9, the word on the street was that it was bad, so I just didn't bother.
Did you ever watch the relaunch?
Yeah, I watched some of the relaunch, and there was exactly one episode that I very much enjoyed, which was the one with the were monster that Kumail Nanjiani was in that episode.
Which we should say that episode is written by Darin Morgan.
Mm-hmm. It's a classic Darin Morgan episode.
It is. Darin Morgan is one of the more popular writers who worked on the show. Obviously, a lot of people who worked on the series went on to bigger things. Morgan wrote some of the most acclaimed episodes of the series. He wrote Jose Chung's From Outer Space. He wrote
the best episode, by the way. That's the best one.
I would have to agree. I do think that is the high point of the series. I wouldn't say it's my favorite necessarily, but it is the best, I think.
Yeah.
He wrote Humbug, the one set in the circus community in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote Clyde Bruckman's Final Repos, which is the Peter Boyle episode. Boyle won an Emmy for it. I believe it won an Emmy for its writing as well. He is sort of often accepted as maybe the great writer of the show, even though he only did a handful of episodes.
Mm-hmm. I would say they're all comedy. They're all a little bit meta. They're all comedy episodes, that sort of lightly satirize the entire concept of these very serious people in black trench coats, coming in to solve all the world's mysteries.
He had a lot of fun with that dynamic, and with Mulder especially, poking fun at that character. I would say that there is a strain of melancholy in his episodes too that shouldn't be ignored either. I mean, they're all very funny, but there's some very real pathos, I think, to the episodes he wrote as well. Mm-hmm. And I do think that Morgan's contributions to both the 9th and the 10th season are really I hate to say it, about the only reason to really pay much attention to the relaunch, which I thought in general was just off. I will say I'm gonna I will say I am a defender of the 8th season of the show, which I know is a place where a lot of people kind of got off the train. It was at the end of the 7th season, Duchovny was in a very public dispute with Fox over salary, and it kind of there was a very real chance that he was going to leave the show, and he did in the 9th season. But in the 8th season, they had to deal with the fact that they only had him they basically only had him committed to do, I think, 12 episodes, so about half the season. Yeah. So they came up with this thing where Mulder is abducted and Scully has a new partner. He's Agent Doggett, played by Robert Patrick. I always really liked this character. I know he's not necessarily... Yeah, I really, really like this character. I wrote a whole piece. If you're interested, X-Files fans, I did write a whole piece in defense of Doggett on the AV Club, but I always thought
it's not his fault, to be fair.
It's not, and the show bakes in the whole... I mean, the show is fully aware that the audience is going to reject him. So a lot of the 8th season is about this new character who's trying to find his footing in a new world, knowing full well that he's going to be constantly compared to his predecessor. That comes up over and over again, and I actually think that the dynamic between him and Anderson in the 8th season really injects some new life, because by the end of the 7th season, the show, I think, was kind of running on fumes a little bit, and there's a case to be made that the show should have ended at the end of the 7th season. But I do think that Doggett and his particular energy brought something new to the show at a time when it really needed that, and I think he deserves better than some fans have given him over the years. So what's your favorite season of the show?
My favorite season of the X-Files is season 3, because I think that they really hit their stride in terms of the balance between Monster of the Week and Mythology. I think the blend of it in that season feels very, like, it's natural, you know, the mythology, neither feels like it's disrupting the other in that season. It works as a whole. And also they were starting to play with the as we were discussing with the Darin Morgan episodes, they were starting to play with the tropes of the show itself in the 3rd season a little bit. And like the 1st season, it didn't quite have its identity yet. Season 2, they're figuring it out. My main issue with season 2 is that Scully gets kidnapped too much, but by season 3, I think they had really found their rhythm.
I hear you, and I love season 3 as well. It's really high up there for me. I think that, for me, I think season 2 is the strongest season. And I agree it does have to work around... So Gillian Anderson got pregnant at the time, which is why they came up with this whole abduction plot. She couldn't be around for a few episodes. So there's an episode that I think counts. Is it maybe the only episode of the X-Files that she's not in? There's a very cheesy second season episode where Mulder goes to Los Angeles.
I know which one you mean.
It's like a sexy vampire episode.
Yes, and they go to a nightclub, and I remember X's The Unheard Music is playing at the vampire nightclub. So hey, whoever the music supervisor was in those early seasons did a great job. There's some great like punk and alt rock in the background on the X-Files. Yeah.
So the show did have to work its way around her absence a little bit in some semi-clumsy ways towards the beginning of the season. But at the same time, the 2nd season for me is really when this show became what it wants to be. You could just see an immediate uptick in confidence. I think both visual, conceptual, in the writing. My favorite aspect of the show is the way that it tackles this kind of formulaic case of the week. I do genuinely really love the formula of this show, which is Mulder and Scully going to a town and investigating something strange. Mulder has an idea of what it might be. They slowly figure it out. I think that in the 2nd season, the show really produced some of its best episodes, just sort of playing with that general formula. And you could see that the show knew what it wanted to be at that point. And I think there are some... the 3rd season has, as we mentioned, Jose Chung from Outer Space, that probably the best episode of the series, is in season 3, as is Clyde Bruckman. Morgan has a 2nd season episode, though, called Humbug that I think is great. And I just... I I really think that the platonic ideal of what the X-Files can be is in that second season. And I'll say too that the Mythology episodes, which have never necessarily been my favorite, some of the strongest ones are in that second season. There's a great one called Endgame that has this great set of a submarine that's broken through the ice.
Yeah.
And the Mythology would get more and more convoluted as the show went on, but in those early years, there was something more streamlined about it. There was more mystery to them, and in the second season, I think the show really nailed that aspect of it, of its formula.
Well, I'll give you this. I do think that the season 2 premiere, which is Little Green Men, the one where Mulder goes to Puerto Rico to investigate aliens, and then the season 2 finale in Asazi, which is where he's investigating aliens on a Navajo reservation, are 2 very strong Mythology episodes, and particularly the season 2 finale going into the season 3 premiere, like those 2 episodes together are a very good Mythology episodes, so I'll give you that.
Cool. So, favorite episode?
Well, it's not a controversial choice. I think Jose Chung from Outer Space is the best episode of The X-Files. I personally like a lot of stuff from the second, third, fourth seasons. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. I mentioned it earlier, I like the episode Irresistible, which is... Something that's interesting is I've been enjoying the sort of Silence of the Lambs episodes more this time around. Maybe, I recapped Mindhunter for AV Club last year, so, maybe it's just sort of something that I'm more aware of now than I was when I was a kid, the sort of whole criminal profiling thing. But I have been enjoying those episodes more, and Irresistible is a serial killer episode, and there's also an episode in season 4, there's a serial killer episode I like a lot, which is Paper Hearts, which is a combination of a procedural and a Mythology episode. It's sort of a blend there, and I like that one quite a bit as well.
Yeah, it's really hard to pick a single favorite episode, to be honest.
Yeah, it's like, of which type? Because of the witchcraft episodes. There's also, you said season 2 is the best. There's a season 2 episode called Die Hand, Die Virzelit, which is about Satanists at a high school, which is a very good episode as well.
Yeah, I love that one too.
Yeah, that one's really good.
You mentioned Silence of the Lambs before, and I think actually one of the greatest moments of the show is kind of a direct tribute to Silence of the Lambs. It's a season 1 episode. I know season 1 sometimes is seen by fans as a slightly more primitive version of the show. It hadn't quite figured out what it was yet, and there are some real clunkers in the first season. But I would put the season 1 episode Beyond the Sea, I would put up against anything the show did afterwards. It's the episode where Scully's father dies. Yeah. And the two end up, her and Mulder end up investigating. There's this case where some young girls have been kidnapped, and they suspect that that the person who's done it is working with a convict somebody on death row. The character's name is Luther Lee Boggs, which by the way is a great name, but he's played by Brad Dourif, and he claims he's psychic, and the whole episode is built around this tension between Mulder believing that the guy is a scam artist and that he's just trying to get out of the electric chair, basically get out of the death penalty, and Scully who what's the show's motto? I want to believe. I think in that episode,
and
is
also
one of the episodes,
trust no one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely an episode where Scully is fighting with her desire to believe that Boggs really has these powers because he might be able to speak to her father. I think it's like an enormously moving episode, and some of the best acting she ever did on the show with Boggs and Dorf, but is one of the best guest stars they ever had. I think he's very much doing a kind of he's very much playing a Lecter-ish figure, but putting his own spin on it.
One thing about the X-Files that is really fun is a lot of actors who went on to become famous did time on the X-Files. Like, for example, there's an episode in season 6 called Drive. The guest stars Bryan Cranston, and that's the one that I referred to earlier. This X-Files does Speed, but like basically all the elements of Breaking Bad, because Vince Gilligan, who went on to create Breaking Bad, worked on the X-Files. All the elements of Breaking Bad are in this episode. Bryan Cranston's there. It's set out in, a trailer out in, I believe it is Nevada. It's either Nevada or Utah. I forget which one. But it's out west, just all the pieces are in there. And I think that's there are a lot of familiar faces when you watch X-Files episodes, which is always really just a great time.
It is.
It's not the best episode, but there is a season season 2 episode that has Giovanni Ribisi and Jack Black, both as young men in it. That is also one of the more delightful guest starring turns on the show.
I agree, that episode's a lot of fun.
So how do you feel like the show has aged, Dowd, going back and looking at it now? Because, I was referring to earlier that the show kind of muddies. I mean, when you look at it in terms of, you can see where the culture has changed, particularly in episodes where Mulder and Scully are investigating. Like, there's an episode that deals with Haitian refugees and voodoo and, like, African folk tales. And there's one episode set in Chinatown in San Francisco. And it's not, like, overtly insensitive, but it also wouldn't fly on TV nowadays. I think when the show does a Monster of the Week in an ethnic subculture, those have not aged very well, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them at least attempt to be respectful and don't always accomplish that. They are. Yeah, I agree that those aspects of the show are sometimes rather dated. There's a lot about the show that's a little dated. Mm-hmm. I think some of its gender politics sometimes are pretty dated too. But in at least one respect, I think the show remains pretty timely, and I think that it's paranoia about government corruption, and it's fear of things happening behind the scenes that the rest of that the country is not allowed to know about. I think that stuff honestly still looks pretty timely, and I think its depiction of government bureaucracy, but also of, it's a total sci-fi fantasy viewing of government conspiracy, obviously. It's one that's not particularly steeped in reality, but I do think that the show's political conscience is there and has held up pretty well. Yeah,
there is an episode in the 4th season that's a background, sort of a backstory episode for the cigarette smoking man, which is one of the big antagonists in the show. He's the shadowy figure behind the scenes who makes everything work, and there's a scene in that episode where the cigarette smoking man is sitting with all of his minions around a conference desk, and they're discussing how they're going to rig the Oscars and the Super Bowl for that year.
Yeah. Which, that kind of stuff is maybe kind of silly, but I
think it's meant to be comedic. But
yeah, I do think some of the sort of deeper conspiracy aspects of the show obviously are fantasy. I do think that the show's political conscience and its notions about government are not so radically outlandish.
Well, we are in a new golden age of conspiracy theory now, so in that way, it does remain quite timely. Well, that's all for us on the X-Files. This week was a sort of a special diversion into television, but please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts, and we've got a lot of movie discussion there for you.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. We'll be back soon with a brand new episode. Thanks.
Thanks.